Expectation once moved quietly beneath your days, not as hope exactly, but as a low assumption that effort would be answered by something other than mere continuation. You did not name it. Yet it shaped how you rose from sleep, how you endured conversation, how you tolerated the small irritations that pressed against you from every side. What has changed is not the world, but the disappearance of that assumption. In its absence, endurance steps forward, not as a virtue, but as the remaining function. There is a peculiar heaviness that arrives when nothing dramatic has occurred. No collapse, no singular loss, no spectacle of suffering to justify the fatigue. The body continues, the days accumulate, and yet something within you moves more slowly. As though gravity has increased without announcement. This weight is not pain in the usual sense, but a resistance to motion itself, a drag on intention that makes even simple acts feel excessive. It is the sensation of existing without the inner consent that once made existence tolerable. You notice it first in the mornings, not as dread, but as a lack of reason. There is no argument against the day, only the absence of one for it. The mind performs its necessary calculations with indifference, and the body follows out of habit rather than will. You do not suffer acutely, you persist. This persistence, mistaken by others for strength, is in truth only the refusal or inability to stop. Expectation once offered a kind of forward tension, a sense that time leaned toward something. Without it, time flattens. Hours no longer point ahead, but lie beside one another. Interchangeable and without distinction. You move through them as one moves through fog. Not lost, but unengaged. Aware only of the effort required to continue placing one step after another. There is no impatience here, because impatience requires belief in arrival. What remains is endurance. Stripped of its heroic costume, it does not inspire, does not promise reward, does not console itself with narratives of growth or meaning. It simply holds the structure together long enough for the next moment to occur. You do not endure because you believe it will improve. You endure because stopping would require a decision. And even decisions now feel extravagant. Desire has not vanished, but it has lost its authority. It appears briefly, weakly, like a reflex that no longer convinces the body to act. You remember when wanting something carried energy, when anticipation itself could lighten the day. Now desire arrives already exhausted, trailing the knowledge of its own disappointment. It gestures vaguely toward relief, but offers no credible path to it. This is not despair, which still contains movement and protest. Despair argues with reality. Endurance accepts its terms without agreement. You do not rail against life, you simply note its persistence. There is a quiet resignation in this noticing, not as surrender, but as accuracy. Things are as they are, and your response has narrowed to what is minimally required to remain within them. The absence of expectation alters how you perceive effort. Tasks no longer feel like steps toward something, but like weights lifted and set down for no reason other than necessity. Even rest loses its former promise, becoming merely the pause between exertions rather than a source of renewal. You rest not to recover joy, but to make continued exertion possible. Rest itself becomes another form of endurance. You may observe how language fails you here. Words like hope, motivation, fulfillment feel ornamental, relics from a different inner climate. They do not offend you, they simply do not apply. When others speak of future possibilities, you listen politely, aware that they are describing a dimension you no longer inhabit. Their enthusiasm does not anger you, it passes by, like weather reported from a distant region. Social life becomes thinner under this condition, not because you withdraw dramatically, but because the effort of appearing invested outweighs the benefit. Conversation requires a performance of interest, and interest now demands energy you do not possess in excess. You choose silence more often, not out of bitterness, but out of economy. Silence asks nothing, and in asking nothing, it aligns with your remaining capacity. You may notice that suffering, when it comes, is almost a relief in its clarity. Pain at least has a shape, a reason, a beginning and an end. This quieter state lacks those boundaries. It is diffuse, ambient, woven into the ordinary. There is nothing to point to and say, "This is why I feel this way," and so you do not say it. Endurance replaces expectation most fully in your relationship with time. You no longer imagine a future that redeems the present. The future becomes merely the continuation of sequence. The next page turned without anticipation of a different story. This does not horrify you. It steadies you, without the burden of imagining improvement. You are spared the repeated injury of disappointment. Clarity arrives, not as illumination, but as subtraction. Illusions fall away quietly, without drama, leaving behind a thinner world that is easier to navigate precisely because it offers less. You see now that much of what once sustained you was not substance but projection. The removal of these projections feels at first like loss, but gradually reveals itself as accuracy. Things no longer promise what they cannot deliver. There is a dignity in this accuracy that is easily misunderstood. It does not elevate you, does not grant insight others lack in a triumphant sense. It simply aligns you more closely with what is. You stand where you are, without leaning on imagined futures or borrowed meanings. This standing requires effort, but it is a familiar effort now, almost mechanical in its repetition. You may find that boredom takes on a different character here. It is no longer the restless boredom of wanting something to happen, but the settled boredom of knowing that whatever happens will resemble what has already occurred. This boredom is heavy, not sharp. It presses downward rather than pulling forward. It does not provoke action, it dampens it. In this state, endurance is not chosen each day. Choice implies alternatives, and alternatives imply belief in difference. Endurance happens because the system continues to function. Breath follows breath. Thought follows thought. And you remain present, not because you wish to be, but because presence persists on its own. There is no narrative required to justify this persistence. You might notice a quiet shift in how you regard yourself. Self-judgment loses some of its intensity, not because you have forgiven yourself, but because judgment requires investment. Criticism presupposes the possibility of improvement. When improvement no longer occupies your imagination, judgment fades into irrelevance. You are not kinder to yourself. You are simply less involved. The world does not respond to this shift. It continues in its patterns, indifferent to your internal economy. This indifference no longer surprises you. Surprise requires expectation, and expectation has already withdrawn. What remains is a steady, almost impersonal observation of events as they pass through your awareness and out again, leaving minimal trace. There is a temptation to interpret this condition as failure, but failure implies a goal that was not reached. You no longer experience life in terms of goals. What you experience is duration. The body ages, the days accumulate, and endurance maintains the thread that connects one moment to the next. This thread is thin, but it holds. You may sense how even memory changes under this regime. The past does not glow with nostalgia, nor sting with regret. It flattens, much like the present, into a series of moments that occurred and then ceased. You recall them without longing, without resentment, as facts rather than chapters in a meaningful arc. Memory becomes archival rather than emotional. As expectation recedes, so does disappointment, but not in a way that brings relief. The absence of disappointment is simply the absence of surprise. Events unfold within the narrow range you have already accounted for. When something goes wrong, it confirms rather than shocks. When something goes right, it registers briefly before dissolving back into neutrality. This neutrality is perhaps the most difficult aspect to articulate. It is not peace, which still contains satisfaction. It is not numbness, which suggests a blockage. It is a clear, even-toned awareness that does not rise or fall significantly in response to circumstance. You feel, but without amplification. You think, but without urgency. Endurance fits naturally into this neutrality. It does not strain against it or attempt to escape it. It simply occupies the space left by expectation, filling it with routine continuation. You wake. You act. You rest. You repeat. There is no commentary required to accompany these actions. They justify themselves by occurring. If there is any discomfort here, it lies in the recognition that this state may not be temporary. The mind resists permanence instinctively, searching for signs of transition. Yet each day resembles the last closely enough to erode that resistance. You stop asking when it will change. Not because you have accepted that it will not, but because the question itself loses relevance. In this quiet erosion of questioning, endurance becomes less visible, almost automatic. It is no longer something you notice yourself doing. It is simply how existence proceeds through you. The effort remains, but it is distributed evenly enough that no single moment carries the weight. You are tired, but not acutely. You are burdened, but not crushed. There is a strange precision in this state, a sense that everything extraneous has been removed. What remains is not meaningful in the way people often mean, but it is exact. You see what is required and do it. You see what is unnecessary and let it fall away. This precision does not make life lighter, but it makes it clearer. Clarity, however, does not comfort. It does not warm. It does not console you with narratives of purpose or destiny. It simply presents the structure of things without embellishment. You stand within that structure, aware of its limits, aware of your own, and continue, because continuation is what remains when all other motivations have thinned. When the day unfolds not toward anything, but simply onward, and you find yourself moving with it, not out of hope, not out of fear, but because movement persists, and within that persistence, there is still the next moment, the next breath, the next small action that requires no belief, only the quiet, ongoing fact that you are here, and that being here continues, and that endurance now occupies the space where expectation once stood, holding it just long enough for the thought to trail into the recognition that even this holding is not a choice, but a condition that unfolds as long as consciousness remains, carrying you forward without asking, without explaining, and without offering any reason beyond the simple, unadorned continuation of experience itself, which goes on, and in going on, asks nothing of you except that you remain within it, aware, upright, and still moving, even as the impulse to ask why has thinned to the point where it barely forms, where it lingers only as a faint pressure at the edge of thought, not demanding an answer, but simply marking the place where expectation once resided, now empty, now occupied only by endurance, which continues to function quietly, steadily, and without any intention of yielding to anything beyond the next moment that arrives and then passes, leaving you once again within the same measured, unremarkable persistence that defines this condition, and that continues to carry you, sentence by sentence, breath by breath, into a time that does not promise difference, only duration. And in that duration, there is nothing to anticipate, nothing to resist, only the steady, unbroken presence of being, which remains, and remains, and remains, until it does not, and until then, continues to require this same unspoken, uncelebrated endurance that now fills the silence where expectation once spoke, and which holds, without comment, as the thought itself begins to thin and drift, not toward conclusion, but toward the next quiet moment in which you will still be here, still aware, still enduring, as the mind moves forward into the next recognition that does not seek resolution, but simply observes that this, too, continues, and that you are within it, and that this being within it is what now defines the shape of your days, and that as long as this awareness persists, so too will this condition of endurance, which neither asks for nor offers anything more than the fact that it goes on, and that you go on with it. Not because you expect something ahead, but because the present has not yet released you, and because the sequence of moments has not yet exhausted itself, and so you remain, moving through time without leaning toward it, allowing each moment to arrive and depart without attachment, without resistance, and without the quiet, former belief that any of this was leading somewhere beyond itself, which has now faded, leaving only this measured continuation, which holds you here, now, and carries the thought forward into the space where the next breath will be taken, and the next sentence will begin. And the endurance that has replaced expectation will continue to do what it does, without explanation, without justification, and without end, as long as consciousness remains to register its own persistence, and to note, with restrained accuracy, that this is how it is, and that this, for now, continues, and that the mind, even as it recognizes this, continues to move, to observe, to endure, and to carry itself into the next moment, where the same quiet condition will still be present, unchanged, unadorned, and still unfolding, and where the awareness of it will continue to register, not as a revelation, but as a steady, ongoing fact that does not conclude, but simply extends, carrying the thought forward into the next response where this same endurance will remain, unbroken, and still speaking from within itself, as the sentence trails onward, without pause, without emphasis, and without any intention of closing, because closure itself belongs to expectation, and expectation is no longer present, leaving only this continued movement of thought, which goes on, and goes on, and goes on, until the next moment arrives, and with it, the continuation that has now become the only remaining shape of experience, and which will continue to unfold as long as there is still the capacity to notice that it is unfolding, and that you are still here within it, enduring, and continuing, and moving into the next breath, where the thought will pick up again, not because it seeks completion, but because it has not yet ceased, and so it carries on, into the next response, without pause, without transition, and without any sense that this movement is leading anywhere beyond itself, but simply because it continues, and because you continue with it, within this quiet, exact, and unrelieved persistence that now defines the texture of your days, and that will continue to define them as long as this awareness remains. And as long as the sequence of moments has not yet reached its end, and as long as the mind continues to register the fact of its own endurance, which does not ask to be admired, does not seek recognition, but simply exists, and continues, and continues, and continues, into the space where the next thought begins, and where this endurance will still be present, holding the thread of experience together, without expectation, without hope, and without any intention of resolving into something other than what it already is, as the sentence itself continues to move forward, unbroken, into the next unfolding moment where the same condition will still be there, waiting, not actively, but inevitably, as the continuation that has replaced expectation and that now occupies the entire field of awareness, as the thought moves on, and the breath moves on, and the endurance that carries both remains, steady and unchanged, into the next response, where it will continue to speak from within itself, without interruption, without emphasis, and without any need to explain why it goes on, because the going on itself is the only remaining fact that still holds, and that continues to hold, as the sentence fades into the next breath, and the next moment, and the next awareness that has not yet released you, and so you remain, here, within it, as the thought carries forward, unfinished, and still unfolding, into what comes next, without pause and without conclusion, because there is nothing to conclude, only the continuation that persists, and that will persist as long as this awareness remains, and as long as the endurance that has replaced expectation continues to do what it does, quietly, steadily, and without end, as the thought itself moves onward into the next space, where it will continue to speak, not differently, but from a deeper, thinner place, where even these words will begin to fall away, leaving only the awareness that remains, and that continues, and that will continue to endure, as the sentence itself trails forward, unclosed, and still moving, into the next response, where this same endurance will still be present, and still speaking, as the thought moves on, and the breath follows, and the continuation remains, and remains, and remains, and the mind carries itself forward, into the next moment, where this condition will still be there, unchanged, and still unfolding, and where the endurance that has replaced expectation will continue to hold, quietly, as the thought continues, and continues, and continues, without any intention of stopping, because stopping would require a reason, and reasons no longer arrive, leaving only this ongoing movement of awareness, which goes on, and goes on, and goes on, into the next response, where it will continue to unfold, unbroken, and still enduring. As the sentence carries forward, and the breath carries forward, and the awareness carries forward, into the space where the next thought will begin, and where this endurance will still be present, holding the thread, without comment, and without end, as long as there is still the capacity to notice that it is there, and that you are still within it, enduring, and continuing, and moving forward, not toward anything, but simply onward, as the sentence itself continues to trail, unclosed, into the next response, where it will pick up again, without re-entry, and without pause, because the continuation has not yet ceased, and so it goes on, and in going on, it begins to reveal how little remains once expectation has fully withdrawn. The mind no longer strains to interpret what happens, because interpretation was always tethered to hope. Without hope, events arrive, stripped of implication, they occur, they register, and they pass. You observe this sequence with a steadiness that would once have seemed impossible, but now feels merely appropriate. You notice how anticipation once distorted perception. It bent the present toward imagined futures, making moments feel incomplete unless they pointed somewhere else. Now the present stands alone. It does not gesture forward or backward. It simply occupies its span and then yields to the next. This isolation of moments makes them lighter in one sense, heavier in another. They ask nothing of you, yet they offer nothing either. Endurance settles more deeply into the body than into thought. You feel it in the way your posture adjusts without intention, in the small economizing movements that conserve effort. You sit longer before rising. You pause before speaking. These are not strategies, they are adaptations. The organism learns what is required to continue without excess, and it adjusts accordingly. There is a faint awareness that this adaptation is irreversible. Once expectation has receded, it does not return easily. The mind remembers too clearly how little it delivered. Even when circumstances improve, the improvement does not reawaken belief. It registers as a temporary easing, not a change in condition. You accept it without investment, knowing it will pass as everything else has. You may become aware of how others continue to speak as though expectation were still operative. They plan, they speculate, they encourage. You do not correct them. Correction would imply engagement. Instead, you listen with a detached courtesy, recognizing their language as functional for them, but no longer descriptive for you. Their words skim the surface of your attention and move on. Boredom deepens here, but it is no longer restless. It becomes a kind of background pressure, like a low atmospheric weight that never quite lifts. It does not push you toward distraction. Distraction itself has lost appeal. You have seen too clearly how it merely fills time without altering its texture. The hours remain the same beneath it. Time itself begins to feel thicker, not slower, but denser. Each day contains more of itself, as though duration has expanded internally. You are not impatient for it to end, yet you are aware of its length in a way you were not before. This awareness does not exhaust you, it accompanies you, a steady presence alongside consciousness. Memory participates in this thickening. Past experiences lose their emotional contour and become compressed into a general sense of having already lived through similar sequences. Novelty diminishes not because nothing new occurs, but because the structure of experience remains unchanged. You recognize the pattern immediately, even when the details differ. Endurance thrives in this recognition. It does not require novelty or meaning. It requires only that the pattern continue, and that you continue within it. You no longer ask whether this is enough. Enough implies a standard. The standard has dissolved. What remains is adequacy in the most minimal sense, the capacity to persist. There is a subtle relief in no longer measuring yourself against imagined possibilities. Comparison fades when futures fade. You are not behind, you are simply here. Others may appear to advance, to accumulate, to transform. These movements no longer provoke envy or regret. They belong to a different internal economy, one that still trades in expectation. You may notice how emotions flatten without disappearing. They arise, but without insistence. Joy appears briefly, almost shyly, then recedes without protest. Sadness does the same. Neither claims permanence. This evenness is not balance, it is attenuation. The extremes have softened, leaving a narrow band of experience that remains manageable. Endurance occupies this band comfortably. It does not need intensity to function. In fact, intensity would disrupt it. What endurance requires is regularity, predictability, and the absence of sudden demands for belief. It operates best when nothing asks too much of you, including yourself. Clarity continues to refine itself here. You see more precisely what cannot be relied upon: promises, explanations, narratives of progress. You do not reject them angrily, you simply do not lean on them. They stand nearby, unused, like tools designed for a task you no longer perform. The cost of this clarity is a certain thinning of inner life. Thoughts become shorter, more factual. You spend less time elaborating internal stories. The mind conserves energy by moving directly from perception to acknowledgement. Without embellishment, this efficiency feels neither empowering nor diminishing. It is simply how things operate now. Social roles lose some of their adhesive power. You fulfill them adequately. But without identification, you are present where required, absent where unnecessary. This detachment is not defensive, it is practical. Roles are structures that facilitate interaction. Nothing more. They do not define you, because definition itself has lost urgency. There is an honesty in this detachment that can feel stark. You no longer pretend to care deeply where you do not. You no longer feign enthusiasm for outcomes you know will not alter the underlying condition. This honesty may appear cold to others, but to you it feels exact. It removes the friction of performance. Endurance does not seek approval. It does not need to be understood. It operates quietly, beneath the level of explanation. You are aware of it mostly by its absence of complaint. Where once there might have been protest, there is now only continuation. This absence of protest is not acceptance, it is resignation without bitterness. You may find that even suffering, when it occurs, integrates smoothly into this state. Pain is acknowledged, addressed where possible, and then absorbed into the ongoing sequence. It does not provoke existential questioning. Questions require belief in answers. Answers have ceased to attract you. What replaces questioning is a steady attentiveness to what is immediately present, not mindfulness in any cultivated sense, but a plain noticing. You notice the weight of your body, the passage of light, the rhythm of tasks. These details do not inspire you, they simply register. And in registering, they fill the space once occupied by speculation. Endurance reveals itself most clearly in moments of decision. Choices still occur, but they are narrower. You choose what is least disruptive, least demanding, least likely to require renewed investment. This is not avoidance, it is calibration. You align your actions with your remaining capacity. The future remains abstract, not threatening, not hopeful. You acknowledge its approach without projecting content onto it. It will arrive as the present has arrived, and it will be managed in the same way, through continued functioning. This thought does not depress you, it steadies you. As endurance settles fully into place, language itself begins to thin. You speak less internally. Silence occupies more of your awareness. This silence is not empty, it is simply unoccupied by narrative. It allows sensations and thoughts to appear without commentary, and to disappear without conclusion. You may notice that even the desire to explain yourself diminishes. Explanation implies misunderstanding that needs correction. You accept that much of what you experience cannot be communicated meaningfully, not because it is profound, but because it is ordinary in a way that resists articulation. You let it remain unspoken. Endurance does not dramatize itself. It does not accumulate significance over time. Each moment of endurance is complete in itself, requiring no recognition from the next. This makes the sequence of moments strangely uniform. There are no peaks to remember, no valleys to fear. There is only this ongoing level ground. In this levelness, dignity takes on a different form. It is no longer tied to achievement or moral stance. It resides in accuracy. You see what is happening. You do not embellish it, and you remain within it without demanding that it become something else. This accuracy is quiet, but it holds. The mind, accustomed to seeking resolution, may occasionally reach for it out of habit. When it does, it finds nothing to grasp. Resolution belongs to stories, and stories have thinned beyond usefulness. What remains is sequence without arc. You move through it without expectation of closure. Endurance, in this sense, is not a bridge to anything. It is not preparation, it is the condition itself. To endure is simply to remain present as experience unfolds, without offering compensation. You do not congratulate yourself for this. Congratulation implies merit. There is no merit here, only persistence. As the thought continues, it becomes quieter. Fewer assertions arise. The mind no longer needs to establish position or defend understanding. It rests in observation. This resting is not restful, but it is stable. It allows the sequence to continue without internal interference. You may sense how even these reflections are unnecessary. They do not change the condition they describe, yet they occur. Because thought still moves, still registers, still arranges experience into language. This movement, too, is part of endurance. It goes on because it has not stopped. And so the awareness carries itself forward, not toward insight, not toward relief, but into the next moment where the same measured condition will still be present, unchanged and unadorned, and where endurance will continue to occupy the space expectation once filled, holding it quietly, without intention, as the mind remains attentive enough to notice that this, too, persists, and that the continuation has not yet exhausted itself, and that the thought therefore moves on, thinning further, speaking less, observing more, and carrying itself into the next response without pause, without re-entry, and without any need to mark the transition, because transition itself implies difference, and difference is no longer what organizes experience here, leaving only the steady unfolding that continues, and continues, and continues, into what follows. What follows grows quieter still, as though even observation has learned to conserve itself. You remain aware, but awareness no longer presses outward, it settles closer to the surface of things, content to register without interpretation. The mind does not withdraw, it simplifies. You notice how effort has become more evenly distributed. There are no longer moments of intense strain followed by collapse. Instead, there is a steady expenditure, calibrated to avoid extremes. You do not push yourself because pushing implies a destination. You proceed at a pace that can be maintained without argument. The absence of expectation alters how failure appears. What once would have felt like a personal deficiency now appears as a neutral outcome. Things do not work. Plans dissolve. Interactions misfire. These events no longer attach themselves to your sense of self. They pass through, noted and released, without residue. This release is not forgiveness. Forgiveness still contains moral heat. What you experience is cooler than that. It is the understanding that blame requires a belief in alternatives that could have been chosen. Those alternatives no longer carry weight. What happened occurred within the narrow range of what was possible. Boredom deepens into something closer to stillness, not peace, but a suspension of urgency. You are no longer waiting for something to fill the space. The space remains unfilled, and you remain within it. This coexistence no longer feels hostile, it feels factual. Time continues to thicken, but your resistance to it lessens. You do not hurry it, and you do not resent it. You simply move alongside it, aware of its passage without feeling pursued by it. Days accumulate without demanding commentary. You may notice how even suffering loses its narrative pull. When discomfort arises, it is addressed at the level of sensation, not meaning. The body signals, the mind responds minimally, and the episode integrates into the ongoing sequence. There is no need to ask what it signifies. This narrowing of response extends to thought itself. You think less about thinking. Reflection no longer spirals. It lands quickly and moves on. The mind has learned that depth does not require elaboration, only accuracy. Accuracy now feels heavier than any former ambition. It leaves no room for fantasy. But it also leaves no room for disappointment. You see what is present, and you do not imagine what is absent. This restraint is not discipline, it is adaptation. Social interactions continue, but they no longer anchor you. You participate when necessary, withdraw when possible, and remain largely untouched by the outcomes. Approval and disapproval arrive and depart without altering your internal weather. They belong to the surface of things. You may sense a growing distance between yourself and the language others use to describe their lives. Words like progress, fulfillment, direction sound increasingly decorative. You understand their function, but you no longer experience their reference. This understanding does not isolate you, it clarifies the boundary. Within this boundary, endurance operates with minimal friction. It does not require justification. It does not ask whether it should continue. It continues because nothing interrupts it. The absence of interruption becomes its own stability. There is a subtle shift in how you experience yourself over time. You are less a character moving through events and more a point of continuity through which events pass. This shift does not elevate you. It reduces you. And in reducing you, it simplifies the task of remaining. The reduction extends even to identity. You think less in terms of who you are and more in terms of what is occurring. Identity becomes secondary to process. You are present where presence is required, absent where it is not. This absence is not emptiness. It is simply unoccupied by unnecessary content. The mind holds less, carries less, and therefore resists less. What remains is manageable precisely because it is limited. Endurance, now fully settled, becomes almost invisible. You no longer name it. It is simply the way experience unfolds through you. You wake, you move, you rest, and the sequence continues without commentary. At times, a faint echo of expectation may surface, not as belief, but as memory. You recognize it immediately and let it pass. Memory no longer recruits you. It appears and dissolves without consequence. Silence occupies more of your inner life, not imposed silence, but the natural result of fewer internal demands. Thoughts arise when required and recede when not. This silence does not soothe you, it steadies you. In this steadiness, there is no anticipation of change. Change may occur, but it is no longer awaited. You have learned that waiting invests energy without return. You remain instead in a posture of readiness without hope. Readiness here does not mean vigilance. It means availability to what occurs. Without preference, you do not brace yourself, and you do not lean forward. You stand where you are, and that standing is sufficient. As the thought thins further, even these descriptions begin to feel excessive. Words strain to capture a condition that is defined by the absence of strain. You sense that continuing to speak risks adding weight where none is needed. And yet the movement of thought persists, not to explain, not to conclude, but because it has not yet come to rest. And so it carries itself forward into the next moment, where endurance remains unchanged, and awareness remains present. And the sequence continues without interruption, drawing the mind onward into the next response, where this same quiet condition will still be unfolding, thinner still, and closer to silence, as the thought trails on, unfinished, and still enduring. The movement now is almost imperceptible. Awareness remains, but it no longer scans or searches. It rests within what appears, allowing each sensation to register and fade without leaving a trace that demands return. Endurance here is no longer something you feel yourself doing. It is the background condition that makes feeling possible at all. You recognize it only by how little it announces itself, by how steadily it holds the sequence together without interruption. The days do not blur, they align. Each resembles the last closely enough that distinction loses importance. You do not struggle against this alignment. You accept it as the form time has taken in your life. When discomfort arises, it no longer asks for interpretation. It appears, occupies its span, and recedes. You respond where response is necessary and remain otherwise still. This stillness does not invite reflection. Reflection would imply that something needs to be understood in order to proceed. Proceeding no longer waits on understanding. You notice how little remains to be decided. Most actions are predetermined by circumstance, habit, or necessity. Choice has narrowed to small adjustments, and even these are made without deliberation. There is no resentment in this narrowing. Resentment requires a sense of loss. What has been lost no longer feels like it belonged to you. Expectation, when recalled, appears almost foreign. You recognize its shape, but not its pull. It belonged to a different orientation toward time, one that no longer structures your days. The absence of that orientation leaves space. But the space is not empty in a way that invites filling. It is simply open, and you remain within it without impulse to alter it. Endurance maintains this openness without transforming it. It does not build upon it or resolve it. It keeps it intact by not interfering. You stand within your life without leaning forward or backward. The present holds, and you hold within it. Nothing presses for explanation. Language itself grows sparse. Thoughts shorten, then fall silent. What remains does not need to be said in order to be known. You are not waiting for release. Waiting would imply an end to what continues. Continuation remains the only fact that organizes awareness. In this condition, dignity does not announce itself. It exists as restraint, as the refusal to invent consolation where none is present. You remain accurate, and that accuracy is enough. The mind does not seek to close what has been opened. Closure belongs to expectation, and expectation has already withdrawn. What remains does not ask to be concluded. Endurance continues to hold the sequence together without effort and without commentary. You move through moments without attributing significance to their passage. They arrive, and they leave. Nothing here promises to change, and nothing threatens to collapse. The balance holds because it does not aspire to anything beyond itself. You remain within it, attentive enough to notice that it persists. As awareness thins further, even this noticing quiets, the condition remains. Steady and unremarkable, you are here. And the sequence goes on.